I never imagined that a single Thanksgiving dinner could change the course of my life forever. My name is Jack, and for years I believed I was the one who held our dysfunctional family together, paying the bills, supporting my younger siblings, even covering for my parents when their reckless decisions put us all in jeopardy. At Thanksgiving, however, everything fell apart. I was sitting at the dinner table, fork halfway to my mouth, when my father looked me dead in the eye and said, "Jack, you have to leave." In that instant, I froze. My mother avoided my gaze, and my younger brother and sister pushed their food around on their plates, as if trying to disappear. My father, calm and almost serene as if he'd already made up his mind, added, "This is our gratitude for your little support." I laughed out loud, thinking it was some twisted joke. But then he continued coldly, "You're not pulling your weight, Jack. You've been here for months, and we don't see much help from you." I tried to protest. Am I not doing my fair share? I've been paying for groceries, takeaway, internet bills, even covering petrol and car maintenance for Dad. But my father interrupted, "You're a grown man. Jack, you should take care of yourself." At that moment, I realized it wasn't just about not paying for some extravagant vacation they had demanded. It was about them using me as a never-ending safety net, expecting me to fix every financial mistake while they laughed in my face. I packed my belongings that very night and left without looking back. For a month, I received no calls, no texts, nothing from the family I had once sacrificed so much for. I found a cheap apartment in a neighboring town. It was small and shabby, but it was mine, and for the first time in months, I wasn't expected to pay for anyone else's expenses. I began to feel a strange sense of liberation in the silence, even though the absence of my family left a bitter sting in my heart. Then, one ordinary day, my phone rang. I saw my mother's name on the screen and hesitated, but something in me told me not to ignore it. With a heavy sigh, I answered. After a long, uncomfortable pause, her voice, quieter than usual, finally emerged, "Jack, we need your help." I almost laughed at the absurdity. What could they possibly need now? I replied dryly, "What's happened with the vacation plans? Did they fall through again?" But then she said something that made my stomach drop. "It's Ryan. He lost $25,000. I felt my heart sink as I demanded, "Ryan, what do you mean? Lost it? How?" Through halting words and muffled background sounds that I could barely make out. My father shouting, my mother sobbing softly. She explained that Ryan had been gambling, that he had borrowed money from some shady backroom loan shark, and then lost it all. $25,000 wasn't just a few poker losses. It was a massive debt that threatened our already fragile finances. My mother continued, voice cracking, "We don't have it, Jack. We're maxed out on our credit cards. We can't even cover next month's rent." I leaned against the wall, my mind reeling with anger and disbelief. A month ago, they had kicked me out for not paying for a luxury vacation. And now they were begging me for help, because Ryan's reckless gambling had plunged them into deep debt. I had saved some money since I moved out, enough to cover at least half of what they needed, but I knew deep down that I had been used time and time again. I reluctantly wired $12,000 that very night, making it clear that it was a loan, and Ryan was expected to pay me back every cent. My mother's sigh of relief and my father's mumbled response did little to ease the anger burning inside me. I called Ryan, and after a tense conversation filled with vague promises of more time and pathetic excuses, I slammed the phone down. "More time?" I shouted into the receiver. "It's been a month, Ryan. You haven't even sent me $20 yet." His feeble reply, barely audible over the background noise of what sounded like a video game, only deepened my frustration. I hung up, feeling betrayed all over again. The weeks that followed were a blur of unanswered calls and mounting resentment. One day, I came home from work to find my apartment door unlocked, a violation of my most basic security. I always locked my door, and yet there it was, ajar. With a sinking feeling, I pushed it open, only to be greeted by chaos. Cushions scattered on the floor, my laptop missing, drawers ripped open, clothes flung everywhere, and my television gone. I stood there in shock, heart pounding, realizing that this wasn't a random break-in. It was my family, using my home as a target for their vengeance. I called the cops immediately, and when the officer arrived, he asked if I had any suspects. Without hesitation, I replied, "My parents and Ryan did it." He took down my statement and asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, I do." The evidence was overwhelming. Pawn shop records and surveillance footage later confirmed that my missing laptop and TV were sold under Ryan's name. In the fallout that followed, Ryan eventually pleaded guilty to burglary, and my parents were charged as accomplices. The news spread quickly. My extended family was shocked, and even our grandparents, who had always been the moral backbone of our clan, were infuriated. They publicly cut off my parents, declaring they would no longer support them when things went wrong. Yet, I still received a call from my father one night, his tone harsh and dismissive. "Jack, handle your own problems. You're an adult now." I couldn't believe it. Family was supposed to help each other. But now, I was just another burden. I sat in my tiny apartment, the silence around me now a strange comfort. I no longer had to pay for anyone else's expenses. My paycheck, once swallowed up by their demands, was now mine to use as I saw fit. I could finally buy something for myself without that crushing guilt. But then, one day, as I sat down to eat some leftover takeout, my phone rang. It was my mother's number. I stared at the screen, a mix of anger and sadness swirling in my chest, and answered with a reluctant, "Hello." There was a pause, then her voice came through, agitated and desperate. "Jack, the internet's down. We can't even watch television. Can you please look into it?" I pretended to be clueless for a moment, then replied slowly, "Oh, I already know what happened. I canceled it." My mother gasped, "What? Why would you do that?" I said coolly, "Because I'm tired of paying for your expenses. From now on, if you need something, you'll have to pay for it yourself." In the background, my father mumbled something indistinctly, and I could almost hear his derisive laugh. The call ended, leaving me with a bitter sense of satisfaction mixed with lingering sorrow. Despite all this, I couldn't help but wonder how deep their selfishness went. I had spent years bailing them out, and now, when they needed help, they expected me to simply fix everything, as if I were an endless resource. A week passed, then two, and still no contact, until one day when I returned home to find my apartment ransacked. My belongings were thrown about, my laptop and TV missing once again, and it became painfully clear. My family had broken into my house. I called the cops immediately. The officer who arrived raised an eyebrow as he surveyed the mess and asked if I had any suspects. I didn't hesitate. My parents and Ryan did it. He took notes, and when he asked if I wanted to press charges, I said yes, without a second thought. The evidence was undeniable. This was revenge, plain and simple. In the following month, Ryan continued to dodge repaying the money I had wired to him. I called him repeatedly, pleaded with him, but all I got were vague promises and excuses. I even tried to ask my parents if they could help him repay me, but my father simply shrugged. "That's your problem, Jack." I felt utterly abandoned by the very people I had supported through thick and thin. It was then that I realized I was not and never would be, their personal bank or safety net. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, reeling from the betrayal and the mounting financial strain, an idea struck me, a simple, almost brilliant solution. I still had access to our parents' Wi-Fi and cable accounts, which had always been in my name. I logged in and, without hesitation, canceled everything. The internet, the cable, even the streaming services. The next morning, my mother called in a panic. "Jack, the internet's down. We can't do anything, not even watch our shows." I replied with measured calm, "You should have paid for it yourself. I canceled it." In the background, my father mumbled something like, "That's your problem." And I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. I drove back to my apartment that night, a mix of anger and a strange sense of freedom pulsing through me. I had taken a stand, and though the pain of betrayal still cut deep, I realized that I was no longer bound by their expectations. I was finally living for myself. But the story wasn't over yet. Just when I thought I'd tasted freedom, I returned home one day to find my apartment door unlocked and my home in complete disarray. Cushions were thrown everywhere, drawers were pulled open, clothes scattered, and my laptop and television were gone again. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that my own family had crossed a line. I immediately called the cops, and when the officer asked if I had any suspects, I answered without hesitation, "My parents and Ryan." The investigation confirmed everything, and soon pawn shop records revealed that my missing belongings had been sold under Ryan's name. The consequences of that day rippled through our already fractured family. Ryan pleaded guilty to burglary, and my parents were charged as accomplices. They were left with criminal records and a level of disgrace that even our extended family couldn't ignore. My grandparents, who had always been the moral anchor in our lives, publicly cut off my parents, insisting that they no longer support their irresponsible behavior. I received a call from my grandfather one day, his voice heavy with anger as he said, "Jack, your parents will regret this day. I promise you that." Though I felt a pang of satisfaction, it was tempered by the deep sadness of having to see my family fall apart. I stood at the threshold of my new beginning, with my small, shabby apartment as a sanctuary from the chaos they had left behind. I no longer had to pay for anyone else's expenses, and my paycheck, finally mine to control, allowed me to treat myself without the crushing guilt of supporting their reckless lifestyle. I began to rebuild my life piece by piece, accepting that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that set you free. I learned that true family support comes from mutual respect and honesty, not from being exploited as a personal ATM. Yet, even as I embraced my newfound independence, the pain of betrayal and the sting of being abandoned by the people I loved still haunted me. I spent countless nights staring at my phone, replaying my father's dismissive words and the cold laughter that had echoed when I was kicked out on that Thanksgiving night. But with each passing day, I grew stronger. I started to see the scars not as marks of defeat, but as symbols of resilience, proof that I had survived the worst of betrayal. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat down with a plate of leftover takeout and reflected on everything that had happened. I realized that I had given so much of myself to a family that never truly appreciated or cared for me. I had supported them, paid their bills, bailed them out when they were drowning in debt, and yet, when it was time for them to help me, they turned their backs. It was a bitter lesson in selfishness and the harsh truth that sometimes family is not what you think it is. Just as I was beginning to accept this painful reality, my phone rang unexpectedly. The caller ID displayed my mother's name, a name I hadn't seen on my phone since the day I left. With a mix of trepidation and curiosity, I answered, "Hello." There was a long pause. Then my mother's voice, softer and almost trembling, came through. "Jack, we need your help." I almost laughed at the absurdity. After all, they had kicked me out, and now they were begging me for help again? I replied cautiously, "What happened now?" Her next words made my heart sink further. "Ryan lost $25,000 gambling." My mind reeled as I listened to her explain, with background voices of anger and frustration, how Ryan had borrowed money from a shady loan shark and lost it all in a reckless gamble. I could barely understand it. Ryan, barely old enough to drink, had somehow managed to accumulate such a colossal debt. My father's voice came in later, grumbling about due dates and backroom loans, while my mother sobbed softly about not having enough money for next month's rent. I was faced with a choice. Should I help them again, even after everything they had done to me? Or should I finally let them face the consequences of their own actions? The decision tore at me. On one hand, I still cared about my brother, flawed as he was, and the thought of him sinking deeper into debt was unbearable. On the other hand, I was done being taken advantage of. I decided, with a heavy heart, to wire $12,000, my limit, and made it clear that it was a loan, not a gift, and that Ryan was expected to repay every damn cent. In the days that followed, as I trudged through my small apartment, I felt a mix of bitterness and a strange, burgeoning sense of freedom. I was no longer the family safety net, the one who held everything together for others, while my own needs were trampled upon. I was beginning to live for myself, free from the constant demands and the never-ending cycle of abuse. Yet, even as I embraced this new chapter, I couldn't help but wonder if my parents would ever learn that family support means mutual respect, not exploitation. The turning point came one day when I returned home to find my apartment door unlocked and my belongings in complete disarray. It was as if someone had deliberately turned my safe haven into a chaotic battleground. My laptop and TV were missing, drawers were torn open, and clothes were strewn everywhere. I knew immediately that it was my family. They had broken into my home to send a message. I called the cops, and when the officer asked if I had any suspects, I replied without hesitation, "My parents and Ryan did it." The investigation confirmed everything. The missing items were sold under Ryan's name at a local pawn shop, and the evidence was irrefutable. In the months that followed, the fallout was swift and merciless. Ryan eventually pleaded guilty to burglary, and my parents were charged as accomplices. Even our extended family was shocked. My grandparents, who had always been the moral compass, publicly cut off my parents, declaring that they would no longer cover for their selfish mistakes. I received a call from my grandfather one night, his voice heavy with anger as he said, "Jack, your parents will regret this day, I promise." Although I felt a pang of vindication, it was tempered by the deep sadness of seeing my family fall apart. As I stand here, looking back on the chaos that tore my family apart, I feel a mix of liberation and profound sorrow. I've learned that no matter how deeply you are exploited or betrayed by those you call family, truth has a way of emerging from even the darkest corners. That Thanksgiving night, when my own parents and brother turned their backs on me for not paying for a lavish vacation, I thought I'd lost everything. I was kicked out, abandoned, and left to fend for myself. Yet, in the silence of my small, new apartment, I found a strange freedom. A life where my paycheck was mine to use, where I wasn't burdened with someone else's mistakes. Then, when they called me back, desperate over Ryan's massive gambling loss, I realized they expected me to be their endless safety net. I helped them out, but that kindness was met with ingratitude and, eventually, a vicious betrayal. My own family broke into my home, stole my belongings, and left me shattered. It was the final blow, A clear message that I was just a resource to be used and discarded. Now, as the cops took statements and pawnshop records confirmed their misdeeds, Ryan pleaded guilty to burglary, and my parents faced the harsh reality of criminal charges. I stand at the crossroads of my new beginning. The betrayal and manipulation have left deep scars, but they also serve as reminders that I have the strength to rebuild my life on my own terms. My parents' selfishness and Ryan's reckless behavior have isolated them in a world of regret, while I reclaim my dignity and my right to live freely without being their bank, their scapegoat, or their endless safety net. I've learned that true family support isn't about shouldering everyone else's burdens, it's about mutual respect and honesty. Sometimes, the most painful decisions, like cutting ties with those who refuse to grow, are the ones that set you free. Now, I choose to build a future defined by self-respect and integrity, leaving behind the toxic legacy of betrayal and exploitation. What about you? Have you ever been betrayed by those you trusted, only to find that standing up for yourself was the first step toward a brighter future? How did you transform your pain into strength? And what did you learn about the true meaning of family and loyalty? I invite you to share your stories and insights, so that together we can create a community where every scar is a testament to our resilience and every act of self-respect lights the way forward.